A sterile millionaire with 1 month left to live adopted triplet girls who were living on the street. Everyone laughed at him when he was about to take his final breath. What the triplets did changed his life forever. The small house with peeling walls and worn-out furniture sheltered more love than many mansions. Ivan Perez, a 42-year-old man with premature wrinkles and hands calloused from years of hard work as a nurse in public hospitals, was playing animatedly in the living room with his 7-year-old triplet daughters. The afternoon sun came through the simple windows, illuminating the only true luxury of that home, the laughter of the girls. The father's deep brown eyes shone with pride as he watched his little ones growing, despite the difficulties they had faced since their mother's death during the complicated birth of the triplets. His joy was genuine, even though his body carried a weariness he had been trying to hide for weeks. "Daddy, now it's your turn to be the patient," said Leah, the most outgoing of the three, placing a toy stethoscope on her father's chest while the other two waited with improvised paper bandages. "You always take care of everyone at the hospital. Now we're going to take care of you." The triplets, identical at first glance to strangers, were easily distinguishable to Ivan. Leah, the oldest by just 5 minutes, had a determined and responsible look, always ready to lead. Isabel, the middle one, was observant and analytical, rarely speaking without thinking first. Iris, the youngest, sensitive and dreamy, had the easiest smile and the most open heart. They all wore simple clothes, but impeccably clean, small flowery dresses that their father bought on sale and that they loved to wear together. Their dark brown hair was tied in identical braids made by their father every morning before school in a ritual he never failed to fulfill. "You would be great nurses, my little ones. Maybe even better than Daddy," Ivan smiled, allowing himself to be examined by his daughters, hiding with effort the growing pain he had been feeling in his chest for days. "When you grow up, you'll be able to help many people, just as I've tried to do all my life." The game continued for a few more minutes, with the girls completely absorbed in their role as doctors, asking serious questions about imaginary symptoms and prescribing fantasy medicines. Ivan responded with the same seriousness, valuing the intelligence and creativity of his daughters. The simple house became a make-believe hospital where real concerns were momentarily suspended. The father observed between smiles how the girls accurately reproduced medical terms they must have heard from him over the years. His heart swelled with pride, even as a stronger twinge made him briefly hold his breath. "Dar. Iris, I think the patient needs a special medicine to get stronger," declared Isabel seriously, adjusting invisible glasses on her small face. "He's working too hard at that hospital and needs to rest." It was at that moment, as if Isabel's words had conjured the reality Ivan was trying to deny, that the pain exploded in his chest. Not like the previous twinges, which he could disguise with a deeper breath or a subtle change in position. This was a devastating pain that made him clutch his chest with both hands and fall to the side, knocking over the small living room table. His face contorted in an expression of agony that his daughters had never seen before. The three girls froze for a second, the childish world of play instantly crumbling in the face of frightening reality. "Daddy! What is it?" "Daddy!" shouted Leah, being the first to react, kneeling beside her father, who was now writhing on the floor. "Isabel, Iris, we need real help. It's not a game." While Leah remained by her father's side, holding his hand with strength disproportionate for a child her age, Isabel ran for the phone, dialing the emergency number that Ivan had made them all learn since they were very young. Her voice, normally calm and methodical, came out trembling as she explained the situation to the operator. Iris, meanwhile, opened the front door and ran to the neighbor's house, knocking desperately until someone answered. The three, even so young, acted with instinctive coordination, as if they had rehearsed for this terrible moment. "Hang on, Daddy, please." "Hang on," whispered Leah, tears flowing freely down her face as she held her father's hand. "The ambulance is coming. You're going to be okay. You promise? You have to promise." The minutes that followed seemed an eternity to the triplets. Ivan, between spasms of pain, struggled to maintain consciousness, not for himself, but for his daughters, who looked at him with terror in their eyes. The neighbor, an elderly gentleman who always helped the family when needed, arrived with Iris and knelt beside Ivan, speaking words of encouragement that sounded hollow given the gravity of the situation. Sweat ran down Ivan's pale forehead, contrasting with the growing paleness that took over his face. "My daughters, stay together," Ivan murmured between laborious breaths, squeezing Leah's hand while also trying to reach the other two, who now knelt by his side. "Never separate. Promise." When the ambulance finally arrived with its flashing lights and siren echoing through the quiet street, the paramedics acted quickly. They assessed Ivan's vital signs, administered emergency medication, and placed him on the stretcher with precise and efficient movements. The triplets watched everything with wide eyes, clinging to each other as if already putting into practice the promise demanded by their father. The neighbor tried to comfort them, but his words seemed to come from far away, muffled by the buzzing fear that dominated the girl's ears. "You can come with him in the ambulance," said one of the paramedics, noticing the desperation in the children's eyes. "You're his daughters, right? Come, stay together. Your father needs you now." The journey to the hospital was a blur of lights, sounds, and fear. Sitting on a small bench inside the ambulance, the three girls held each other's hands tightly while watching the paramedics working on their father. Ivan, now with an oxygen mask covering part of his face, kept his eyes fixed on his daughters whenever the pain allowed. There was a silent request in that gaze, a plea for them to remain strong, united, as they had always been since birth. "Will he be okay? Please tell me he'll be okay," asked Iris to the paramedic who monitored Ivan's vital signs. "He's the best dad in the world. He can't. Upon arriving at the community hospital, the organized chaos of an emergency enveloped everyone. Ivan was quickly transferred to a hospital gurney and taken down a hallway, while the triplets ran to accompany him, their small legs barely able to keep up with the adult's pace. A nurse gently tried to hold them back, explaining that they needed to wait, but the determination in Leah's eyes made her reconsider. Understanding the situation, she allowed the girls to stay close as long as they didn't interfere with the medical team's work. "Doctor, they're his daughters, triplets. From what I understand, they have no one else," explained the nurse to the doctor who was now examining Ivan. "I think it's better to let them see their father when he's stabilized. The situation seems complicated." The following hours passed in a cold and impersonal waiting room, with the triplets sitting together in a single seat, as if merging into one could somehow diminish the fear they felt. Nurses occasionally passed by, offering cups of water or gentle questions that the girls barely registered. The clock on the wall seemed to move in slow motion, each minute stretching like an hour. Leah kept her arm around Iris's shoulders, who cried silently, while Isabel observed every movement in the hallway, calculating, analyzing, looking for any sign of hope. "He always took care of everyone," whispered Iris, wiping away tears with the sleeve of her dress. "He never complained, even when he was very tired. Why did this have to happen to him?" When the triplets were finally allowed to see their father, he had been transferred to a small but private room, a kindness due to the fact that he was a colleague in the profession, even though he worked at another hospital. Ivan was lying in bed, connected to various monitors and with an intravenous line in his arm. His skin, normally a healthy tone, was grayish under the fluorescent hospital lights. But his eyes, those eyes that always overflowed with love for his daughters, still shone when they entered the room. "My little warriors," called Ivan with a weak voice, extending a trembling hand toward his daughters. "Come closer. I need to look at you properly." The girls approached cautiously, frightened by the tubes and machines, but desperate for the comfort that only their father could offer. They climbed onto the edge of the bed, one on each side and one at the foot, forming a protective circle around him. Leah held her father's right hand, Isabel the left, while Iris gently touched his feet, covered by the hospital sheet. The nurse who was adjusting the monitors exchanged a meaningful look with the doctor who had just entered, both recognizing the beauty and tragedy of that scene. "You were so brave today. I'm so proud of how you acted," Ivan spoke, each word clearly costing him a tremendous effort. "You are the light of my life. You always have been from the first moment. The triplets sensed that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just their father's paleness or the machines around him. It was something in the air, in the way adults avoided looking directly at them, in the way their father spoke, as if he were trying to put a lifetime of love into a few sentences. Isabel, always the most perceptive, was the first to understand, and her eyes filled with knowledge too painful for her age. "Dad, you're going to get better soon, aren't you?" asked Iris, still clinging to the hope that the other two were beginning to lose. "We'll be able to go home and play doctor again, right?" Ivan looked long at each of his daughters, memorizing every feature, every freckle, every strand of hair. There was so much he wanted to say, so much advice he wanted to give, so many experiences he wished to share with them over the years. How could he explain to 7-year-old children that their time together was coming to an end? How could he prepare them for a world that would be infinitely harder without him to protect them? "My little ones, do you remember the stories I tell about Mom? How brave and strong she was, even when she was afraid." Ivan breathed deeply, gathering strength. "Sometimes, even when we love someone very much, we cannot stay together as we would like. But love never ends." With trembling hands, Ivan reached for the pocket of his hospital shirt, retrieving a silver medallion he always carried with him. It was one of the few tangible memories he had of his late wife, a gift she had given him before the birth of the triplets. Inside was a photo of them together, young and smiling, full of hope for the future they planned with the daughters who were yet to come. "This medallion is very special. Inside it are the two people who loved and will always love you the most, no matter what happens, your mother and I," explained Ivan, opening the medallion to show the photograph. "Now I want it to belong to you three." With visible effort, Ivan closed the medallion and, to the girl's surprise, used the last of his strength to break it into 3 parts. The metal yielded along lines that seemed predestined to separate, as if the object had always been made to be divided. Each fragment contained a part of the image, incomplete on its own, but when brought together with the others, formed the whole picture. "For each of you, a piece of this medallion. As long as you have it, you will always be connected to each other and to us," said Ivan, handing a fragment to each daughter with reverent care. "Promise me, promise now, that you will never separate, no matter what happens." The girls took the fragments with solemn seriousness, instinctively understanding the profound meaning of that gesture. It wasn't just an object. It was a symbol, a physical reminder of the promise they were making. Ivan's eyes, though tired, shone with intensity as he watched his daughters examining the pieces of the medallion. "I promise, Daddy, I will take care of my sisters with all my courage," said Leah, determination shining through the tears she was trying to hold back. "We will never separate." Isabel held her fragment carefully, analyzing it with her observant eyes before speaking. "I promise to use my intelligence to keep us safe and together, Dad. I'll think of solutions for any problem." Iris, the youngest, held her piece against her chest as if it were the most precious of treasures. "I promise to keep our hope alive, Daddy. I'll remember to smile even on difficult days, like you always do." Ivan smiled, a genuine smile that for a moment pushed away the pain and fatigue from his face. His daughters, so young and already so wise, understood their roles in this new journey they would have to face. He wanted to say more, wanted to give them all the possible tools for the future. But time, that cruel enemy, was rapidly running out. "The 3 of you together are stronger than any challenge that comes your way," Ivan managed to say, his voice now little more than a whisper. "Always remember that. Together, you are invincible." At that moment, as a cruel confirmation of the unspoken words, the monitors beside the bed began to beep frantically. Ivan's heart rate, which was already irregular, became dangerously erratic. His face contorted in an expression of pain that he was bravely trying to hide from his daughters. But his body betrayed him. "What's happening? Daddy, what is it?" shouted Leah, clutching her father's hand in desperation. "Someone help. Please, someone help my father." In seconds, the small room filled with medical professionals. A kind but firm nurse tried to move the triplets away from the bed while doctors shouted orders and prepared emergency equipment. The girls resisted, clinging to their father as if they could anchor him to life by the strength of their love. "We need you to leave now, dears," insisted the nurse, her professional voice barely hiding the compassion she felt. "The doctors need space to help your father. You can wait just outside." The triplets were literally dragged out of the room, not out of cruelty, but out of urgent necessity. The last image they had of their father was of him looking directly at them, his eyes conveying all the love that his weakened body could no longer express. The door closed abruptly, leaving them outside, clinging to each other in a desperate embrace, each holding firmly to her fragment of the medallion. "He's going to be okay. He has to be okay," repeated Iris like a mantra, tears flowing freely down her face. "He's Dad. He's strong. He always gets better." The following hours were the longest in the triplets' short lives. Sitting on a bench in the hallway directly in front of their father's room, they observed the constant coming and going of doctors and nurses. No one stopped to talk to them. They all entered and left with grave expressions and hurried steps. The occasional silence, more than the frantic activity, was what frightened them the most. Leah held her sister's hands, her knuckles white from squeezing so hard, as if she feared that by letting go, something terrible would happen. "He's fighting," said Isabel, trying to convince herself as much as her sisters. "Dad is like those superheroes from the stories. He'll overcome this, you'll see." The night advanced slowly. Hospital staff offered food that the girls couldn't eat, blankets that couldn't warm the cold they felt inside. Occasionally, a social worker would come by to check on them, asking questions about relatives they could contact, questions that only increased the triplets' anguish as they knew there was no one. Since their mother's death, their world had revolved exclusively around their father. They had no uncles, grandparents, or cousins who could help. It was just them and Ivan against the world. And now, perhaps just them. "What will happen to us if?" Iris began to ask but couldn't finish the terrible sentence. "I mean, where will we go?" Before Leah or Isabel could respond, the door to the room opened. The doctors and nurses were now coming out, not with the rush from before, but with a heavy and meaningful slowness. The machines inside the room, which had previously beeped frantically, were silent. The lead doctor, a middle-aged man with tired and compassionate eyes, stopped in front of the triplets. His white coat had sweat stains, and his hands, when he ran them through his gray hair, trembled slightly. "You have been very brave today," he said, kneeling to be at eye level with the girls. His countenance was desolate, carrying the weight of someone who had fought an impossible battle and lost. He didn't need to say a word. His expression and body language said it all. The doctor looked at the girls with moistened eyes. His slumped shoulders carried the weight of many battles lost over the years, but few as painful as this one. He gathered what courage he had left, knowing that the words he would say would forever change the lives of these 3 children. Kneeling in front of them with his hands lightly resting on his own knees to maintain balance, he searched for the least cruel words to communicate the devastating news. For a moment, he wished he could change the outcome, offer some hope, but he knew that kindness now was only in being honest. "I'm sorry, girls," said the doctor, his voice deep and soft. "We did everything we could. But your father, he has gone to a better place." The words hung in the air like an inevitable sentence. Leah, Isabel, and Iris remained motionless for a few seconds, as if they didn't fully comprehend the meaning of what they had just heard. It was Isabel, the observer, who first processed the terrible truth, her eyes widening with understanding before filling with tears. Soon, all 3 collapsed into simultaneous sobs, as if they shared not only identical appearances but also the pain that now pierced them. They embraced tightly, forming a small circle of mutual protection against the cruelty of the world that had just taken from them the only person they had. "He can't be gone. He promised he would stay with us," sobbed Iris, the most sensitive, her body shaking with the intensity of her crying. "He said we had to stay together, but he was supposed to be with us, too." The doctor placed a comforting hand on Leah's shoulder, who, among the three, was trying to contain her own weeping to console her sisters. He could see determination rising in the girl's eyes, even through the tears, the premature resolution of someone who needs to grow up too fast. It was a look he had seen many times in children who lost their parents, that exact moment when childhood began to be stolen. He wanted to say something that could ease that pain, but he knew words were insufficient in the face of the magnitude of that loss. "You were the joy of his life until the last moment," the doctor tried to comfort them, his own voice choked with emotion. "He spoke of you until the end, asking that you be strong and stay together." Before the girls could fully process the news, or the doctor could offer any other consolation, a woman with firm steps and an impassive expression approached down the hallway. She wore a somber gray suit and carried a folder full of documents. Her heels rhythmically struck against the linoleum floor, each step echoing like the ticking of a clock, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Her hair was rigidly tied in a tight bun, and thin-framed glasses framed eyes that seemed to calculate more than feel. "May I speak with the girls now?" asked the social worker, with a professional coldness that painfully contrasted with the atmosphere of mourning. "We have urgent procedures to follow." The doctor hesitated, his eyes moving from the children to the newcomer. It was evident that he considered the moment inappropriate, that he wished to give the triplets more time to understand the magnitude of their loss before they were forced to face the practical consequences of orphanhood. But he also knew he had no authority to intervene in this process. With a resigned sigh, he nodded affirmatively and stepped away, but not before casting one last compassionate look at the girls. "Be strong for each other," he murmured softly, words that only the triplets could hear. "It's what your father would want." The social worker didn't wait for the doctor to completely move away before taking control of the situation. With mechanical efficiency, she led the three girls to a small, empty waiting room at the end of the corridor. It was a sterile and impersonal environment with uncomfortable plastic chairs and faded beige walls, illuminated by fluorescent lights that intermittently hummed. There was no effort to make the space welcoming for children who had just suffered a traumatic loss, only a bureaucratic functionality that reflected the social worker's own approach. "I'm sorry about your father," she said, opening her folder on the table and organizing various forms in orderly piles. "We need to resolve where you go now. You don't have other relatives, correct?" Leah, sitting between her sisters and firmly holding both their hands, shook her head negatively. Her eyes, swollen from crying, observed each movement of the social worker with instinctive distrust. Isabel, beside her, analyzed the documents on the table, her analytical brain working even amid the pain, trying to decipher what those papers would mean for their future. Iris, on the other side, continued crying silently, her gaze lost as if still searching for her father in the emptiness. "He always said it was just the four of us in the world," Leah replied, her voice small but firm. "He said we were enough for each other." The social worker made some notes on a form, showing no emotional reaction to the girl's response. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as if she were dealing with statistics and not three shattered lives. The silence in the room was broken only by the hum of the lamp and Iris's occasional muffled sob. For a moment, the only sound was that of the pencil scratching the paper, clinically documenting the tragedy of these children. "As I suspected," the social worker finally spoke, without raising her eyes from the papers. "Unfortunately, we cannot keep you three together. There is no institution with vacancies for three children of the same age. Each of you will go to a different shelter." The words fell like a second devastating blow. If their father's death had been like losing the ground beneath their feet, this new revelation was like discovering they couldn't even fall together. Shock stamped itself simultaneously on the three identical faces. The girls squeezed each other's hands more tightly, as if physical contact could prevent the imminent separation. Silent tears streamed down the faces of Leah and Isabel, while Iris emitted small, broken sobs. "You can't do that," Isabel found her voice, normally the calmest of the three, now trembling with emotion. "We promised our father we would stay together. It was the last thing he asked of us." The social worker finally raised her eyes from the documents, adjusting her glasses with a mechanical gesture. Her gaze contained no active cruelty, only a professional indifference cultivated over years of dealing with similar tragedies. To her, the triplets were just another case, 3 more numbers in an overwhelmed system that had no room for sentimental considerations or promises made to a dying man. "I understand it's difficult, but the system works this way," she explained, her tone didactic and devoid of empathy. "We have protocols to follow and limited resources. Perhaps in the future, you can be reunited if a family interested in adopting all 3 comes along." Leah felt a growing anger replacing part of the pain. Her free hand instinctively sought the fragment of the medallion her father had given her, squeezing it so hard that its irregular edges marked her palm. Ivan's words echoed in her mind with crystal clarity. "Promise you'll never be separated, no matter what happens." She looked at her sisters and saw the same thought reflected in their eyes. At that moment, without needing to speak, the 3 made an irrevocable decision. "When?" asked Leah, trying to keep her voice steady and her face as neutral as possible, disguising the determination now growing inside her. "When will this happen?" The social worker, oblivious to the silent plan that was beginning to form between the sisters, checked her watch with clinical efficiency. Her expression revealed no understanding of the emotional gravity of the situation for the children in front of her, only the desire to complete one more task in her overloaded agenda. She closed the folder with a definitive snap and stood up, smoothing her blazer with precise gestures. "Right now. The vehicles are already waiting to take you," she replied, moving toward the door. "I'll call the drivers. Stay here and don't leave the room. I'll be back to get you." As soon as the door closed behind the social worker, a heavy silence fell over the room. The triplets looked at each other, the communication between them transcending the need for words. Leah, the natural leader, took her fragment of the medallion and raised it. Isabel and Iris immediately did the same. The 3 pieces shone under the cold light of the fluorescent lamps, a tangible reminder of the promise made to their father. "We're leaving now," whispered Leah, her voice low but loaded with determination. "They won't separate us. We promise, Dad." Isabel, always the strategist, was already analyzing the room for escape routes. Her observant eyes quickly identified a small side door that probably led to a bathroom. If there was a window there, they might have a chance. She squeezed Leah's hand in a silent sign of agreement, her brain already calculating possibilities and risks with a maturity beyond her years. "Through the bathroom door," murmured Isabel, discreetly indicating with her head. "If there's a window, we can get out. We have to be quick and silent." Iris, although normally the most fearful of the 3, now showed the same resolution in her gaze. The idea of being separated from her sisters was more terrifying than any danger they might face together. She wiped away her tears with determination, carefully storing her fragment of the medallion in her dress pocket, ensuring it would be secure during the escape they were planning. "I'm scared, but I'm more afraid of being without you," confessed Iris, her voice trembling slightly as she mentally prepared for what was to come. "Where will we go afterward?" There was no time to plan beyond the immediate moment. With an almost imperceptible nod, Leah signaled to her sisters, and the 3 rose simultaneously, moving with the natural synchrony of those who had shared the same space since before birth. They crossed the room in silence, their light steps almost inaudible on the worn linoleum. Leah carefully opened the side door, revealing, as they hoped, a small staff bathroom. The tilting window located above the toilet was narrow but sufficient for 7-year-old children to pass through. Isabel, always practical, immediately pushed the toilet lid down and climbed on it, testing if the window would open. To her relief, although rusty, the hinges yielded with a slight creak. Outside, she could see the hospital's external courtyard, and beyond it, the street and freedom. "It's going to work," whispered Isabel, her calculating tone bringing confidence to her sisters. "I'll help you climb up, and then you can pull me from the other side." Leah nodded, helping Iris climb onto the toilet first. Being the lightest and most agile of the 3, Iris managed to pass through the narrow opening with relative ease, although her dress got momentarily caught on the edge of the window. Outside, she held on to the windowsill and then jumped to the lawn below, falling on her knees but quickly getting up. Isabel held Leah's hand, supporting her to be the next. "Hurry," urged Isabel, hearing distant footsteps in the corridor. "I think they're coming back." Leah went through the window with more difficulty than Iris, her slightly more robust body requiring uncomfortable contortions to pass through the narrow opening. For a terrifying moment, she got stuck at the waist, but with a determined pull, she managed to free herself, falling next to Iris on the lawn. Immediately, the two positioned themselves under the window, extending their arms to help Isabel get out. Isabel, the last to escape, had just climbed onto the toilet when she heard the doorknob of the main door turning. With no time to hesitate, she launched herself through the window forcefully, ignoring the scratching of rusty metal on her arms. Leah and Iris grabbed her hands, pulling her with all the strength their small bodies allowed. When the bathroom door opened, Isabel was already outside, only her feet still visible in the window. "Come back here," shouted the social worker, her normally controlled voice now shrill with alarm as she realized the escape too late. "Stop. You can't go out alone." The triplets didn't wait to hear more. Hand in hand, forming an inseparable chain, they ran across the hospital courtyard toward the side gate that gave access to the street. Their short legs moved in perfect synchrony, driven by both fear and determination. They didn't know where they would go or how they would survive, but they were absolutely certain of one thing: they would stay together, fulfilling the promise made to their father. "Don't look back," instructed Leah as they ran, her voice broken by labored breathing. "Just keep running. Don't let go of your hands." Behind them, they could hear the growing confusion. Alarmed voices called for security. Hurried footsteps echoed across the courtyard. Orders were shouted. The modeled for them. The system had been activated, and now the entire apparatus of social services was mobilized to find the three fugitive orphans. They advanced through the park, their steps producing wet noises on the soaked grass. The cold wind cut through their light dresses, making them shiver uncontrollably. The fragments of the medallion, kept in their pockets, seemed heavier now, as if carrying not only their father's memories but also the responsibility of the promise made to him. "I'm so cold," murmured Iris, her teeth chattering. "I miss Daddy. He always knew what to do." In the distance, beyond the park's boundaries, the sirens continued their persistent song. Through the window of a car passing on the main avenue, they could hear fragments of a radio transmission: 3 identical children, 7 years old, orphans on the run. "Locate them, but don't frighten them." The search was intensifying, and the circle was closing around them. "We're almost there," encouraged Leah, although her own body was trembling from exhaustion and cold. "Just a little more." Finally, after what seemed like an eternity walking under the merciless rain, they spotted the familiar outline of the playhouse, a small wooden structure built to mimic a chalet with colorful windows and a pointed roof. It was smaller than they remembered, but at that moment, it seemed as welcoming as a palace. They ran the last few meters, almost stumbling in their rush to reach that precarious refuge against the storm. "We made it," sighed Isabel as the three squeezed inside the little house, the tight space barely accommodating their small bodies. "At least we're dry here." The playhouse partially muffled the sound of the rain and distant sirens, creating a momentary illusion of safety. Sitting on the wooden floor, the triplets hugged each other, sharing what little body heat they had left. Their wet dresses stuck uncomfortably to their skin, and the cold was beginning to penetrate deep into their bones. But they were together, and that, for now, was all that mattered. "What will we do tomorrow?" asked Iris, her small voice almost lost in the noise of the rain against the roof. "We can't stay here forever." It was a question for which none of them had an answer. 7-year-old children, no matter how determined and brave, were not prepared to face the world alone. They had no money, food, or plan beyond the immediate escape. Reality was beginning to impose itself, bringing doubts that not even the promise to their father could easily dispel. "We'll think about that in the morning," replied Leah, hugging her sisters tighter. "Now we need to rest. Tomorrow we'll find a way." The three settled as best they could in the small space, forming a small circle of mutual protection against the outside world. Each one held her fragment of the medallion, the last gift from their father, like a talisman against despair. The rain continued to fall mercilessly outside, and sirens could still be heard in the distance. But inside that small refuge, they had won a temporary victory. "Promise you'll never leave us, Leah," begged Iris, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, struggling to stay open. "Promise we'll always stay together, no matter what happens." Leah looked at her sisters, perfect copies of herself and yet unique in their own ways. She felt the weight of the responsibility she had taken on, but also the strength that came from the love they shared. With a conviction that surpassed her age, she squeezed her sister's hands and repeated the words that would become their mantra in the difficult days ahead. "I promise by the memory of our father." "We will never separate," declared Leah, her voice firm despite the shiver of cold. "We are stronger together. We always will be." Leah's promise hung in the air like a sacred oath. The three fell asleep, huddled against one another, sleep finally overcoming fear and cold. Throughout the night, the rain continued to fall mercilessly, turning streets into small streams and soaking the park surrounding their fragile refuge. The fragments of the medallion remained firmly grasped in their small hands, even during sleep, as if not even unconsciousness could make them forget the promise made to their father. The noise of the storm muffled the sound of sirens that still traveled through the city in search of the missing triplets. "Even in the dark, I know we're together," muttered Iris in her restless sleep, responding to nightmares that haunted her. "They won't separate us. They won't." In another part of the city, St. Matthew's Hospital stood imposing against the night sky, its illuminated windows contrasting with the darkness of the storm. Unlike the public hospital where Ivan had passed away hours earlier, this was a luxury establishment with marble in the lobby and artwork on the walls. The respectful silence was only broken by the soft ring of telephones and the discreet whisper of impeccably uniformed staff. On the 10th floor, an area restricted only to the city's elite patients, Marco Rodriguez waited alone in a spacious office decorated with solid wood furniture and framed diplomas. "Mr. Rodriguez, the doctor will see you now," announced the secretary with professional efficiency, holding the door for him to enter. "He already has all your results." Marco entered the office with firm steps, his posture straight, and his impeccable suit hiding the anxiety he felt. At 45, he had built a financial empire from scratch, overcoming adversities that would have destroyed less determined men. His graying hair at the temples was the only visible sign of the passage of time on his well-maintained face. The doctor, a middle-aged man with a grave expression, stood up to greet him but didn't smile, a sign that Marco, accustomed to reading people, immediately recognized as a bad omen. "Marco, please sit down," said the doctor, indicating the leather chair in front of his desk. "I have the results of all the tests we conducted this week." The office was too quiet, Marco thought. The kind of heavy silence that precedes devastating news. The soundproof walls ensured privacy but also amplified the feeling of isolation. The doctor, now seated behind his imposing mahogany desk, adjusted his glasses while organizing a series of tests and X-rays. His clinical efficiency seemed almost cruel in the face of the palpable tension in the air. "Let's get straight to the point, doctor." "I'm not a man who beats around the bush," said Marco, his voice controlled, the same tone he used in high-risk business meetings. "I want to know exactly what I have." The doctor breathed deeply before responding, a calculated pause that confirmed Marco's worst fears. Then, with the professionalism of someone who has delivered bad news countless times, he positioned a series of images on the light box on the sidewall. The X-rays and scans lit up, revealing shadows and spots that even Marco's untrained eye could identify as abnormal. The doctor pointed to several specific areas with a red laser pointer, whose bright dot seemed to mark each place where death had planted its flag. "I'm sorry, Marco. It's pancreatic cancer, stage 4, already with metastasis in multiple organs, explained the doctor, his professional voice barely disguising genuine compassion. Treatment options at this point are palliative. Marco received the news with surprising calm, even for him. It was as if some part of him already knew, had already prepared for this moment, since the first pains he had ignored for months, too busy building an empire that now he would have no time to enjoy. His face remained impassive, only a slight tightening of his lips betraying the emotional storm beneath the controlled surface. "How long?" he asked, his voice steady, looking directly into the doctor's eyes as if challenging death to stare back at him. "Be honest with me. I need to organize my affairs." The doctor put down his laser pen and returned to his chair, sitting heavily. There was a certain admiration in his gaze. Marco's response was rare among his patients. No denial, hysteria, or pleas for miracles, just pragmatic acceptance and the need to plan the little time that remained. The doctor consulted his notes, although they both knew he had already memorized the prognosis. 1 month at most, replied the doctor, opting for the raw honesty his patient seemed to prefer. "We can try some procedures to increase your comfort, but it would be irresponsible of me to offer false hopes." 1 month. 30 days. Less time than it took to close most of his important business deals. Less time than he had spent planning his last vacation, a vacation he never took, always postponing until when he had time. The irony wasn't lost on Marco. His entire life had been a race to accumulate more money, more power, more properties. Now, the only resource that truly mattered, time, was irretrievably depleted. "I understand," Marco finally said, adjusting the expensive watch on his wrist as if checking how much time he had left. "I'll want all the documentation to take with me. And please keep this confidential. I don't want the information to leak to the press or to interested parties." The doctor nodded, perfectly understanding the subtext. A man in Marco's position had much to lose if such news leaked. Stocks would plummet, partnerships would be reassessed, and vultures would begin to circle before the body even cooled. While the doctor prepared the necessary documentation and prescriptions, Marco looked out the large window of the office, observing the city he had helped build, the skyscrapers that housed his company's offices, all about to continue existing without him. "Any recommendations for these last weeks, doctor?" asked Marco, still looking out the window, the city lights reflecting in his thoughtful eyes. "Something I should avoid, or something I should finally allow myself to do?" Outside the office, Cassandra Rodriguez waited impatiently, her high heel tapping rhythmically against the marble floor. At 40, she maintained the beauty that had helped her conquer one of the country's richest men a decade ago. Her designer dress perfectly molded the body maintained by discreet surgeries and hours at the gym, while expensive jewelry adorned her neck and wrists, gifts from Marco during their marriage that had lasted only 5 years, ending in a bitter divorce and a generous alimony. Even after the separation, Cassandra maintained the habit of coincidentally appearing whenever Marco had important appointments, carefully cultivating her presence in her ex-husband's life. "He's been in there for almost 2 hours, she complained to the secretary, who politely ignored her, accustomed to the unwanted visits from the former Mrs. Rodriguez. "It must be something serious to take so long." When the office door finally opened, Cassandra immediately adopted a rehearsed expression of concern. Marco came out with a folder of documents under his arm, his face as impassive as always, although an attentive observer might notice a new shadow in his eyes. Before he could reach the elevator, Cassandra intercepted him, strategically placing herself in his path. "Marco, darling, I was just passing by and heard you had an appointment," she said, the obvious lie flowing smoothly from her perfectly painted lips. "Is everything all right? You look worn out." Marco observed Cassandra with a look that mixed weariness and irritation. The coincidence was evidently fabricated. She probably still maintained contacts within his team, informants well paid to track his movements. In other times, he would have confronted this invasion of privacy, but now, with the death sentence echoing in his ears, her presence seemed just another irritating detail in an already sufficiently difficult day. "So, what did the doctor say?" Is it serious? Insisted Cassandra, trying to appear genuinely concerned, while her eyes assessed the folder of documents he was carrying. You know you can count on me, no matter what it is. Marco almost laughed at the irony. Throughout the marriage, Cassandra had never shown genuine interest in his well-being, only in his bank account. The divorce had only made this obsession more transparent with her constant attempts to extract more money through renegotiations and veiled threats. The idea that she could now offer comfort seemed like a bad joke. Nothing you need to worry about, he responded coldly, trying to go around her to reach the elevator, just routine exams. Cassandra was not easily dissuaded, following him down the corridor with the persistence of someone who felt there was something important to discover. Her heels echoed on the floor, creating an irritating rhythm that seemed to pierce Marco's already tired mind. When the elevator doors opened, she entered with him, ignoring his clear desire to be alone. Well, as your ex-wife, I think I have the right to know, she insisted, adjusting a diamond bracelet so that it shimmered under the elevator lights. After all, there's the will to consider. You know, you always promised me that beach house. It was the least after everything I went through with you. There it was, the real reason for her concern. It wasn't about health or well-being, but about what she could extract from him, even now. Marco felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with his illness. The beach house in question, a seaside mansion valued in the millions, had been mentioned casually during one of the few happy periods of their marriage. It wasn't a formal promise, but Cassandra clung to it as if it were a contract signed in blood. Cassandra, I'm tired, said Marco, the terminal diagnosis giving him a new perspective on such pettiness. This isn't the time to discuss properties or wills. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened to the luxurious hospital lobby. Cassandra continued following Marco to the entrance, determined not to let him escape without obtaining the information she sought. Her persistence, which he had once considered merely annoying, now seemed suffocating. The idea of spending his last days dealing with her greed, and that of others who would certainly appear when they smelled death, was unbearable. You're different today, observed Cassandra, narrowing her eyes astutely. There's something you're not telling me, isn't there? You know I'll find out eventually. I always do. Suffocated by her presence and the devastating news still reverberating in his mind, Marco made an impulsive decision. He wouldn't spend one more minute of his precious remaining time with people and situations that only brought him anguish. Ignoring his ex-wife's protests, he headed for the hospital exit, leaving her talking to herself in the middle of the lobby. Where are you going? She shouted, abandoning any pretense of concern. We haven't finished this conversation, Marco. Outside, the night had transformed into a storm. The rain fell mercilessly, soaking him completely in the few seconds it took to leave the cover of the entrance. His driver, seeing him exit, quickly prepared to pick him up with the car, but Marco gestured for him not to approach. He needed air, space, time to process what had happened. Ignoring medical orders for rest, ignoring the comfort his money could buy, he began to walk alone down the street. Mr. Rodriguez, the doctor recommended that you not expose yourself, called the driver, concerned, holding an umbrella. At least let me take you home. The rain washed Marco's face, mixing with the tears he finally allowed to fall, the first in more than a decade. There was something strangely liberating about being like this, completely vulnerable before the elements, when for so long he had hidden behind walls of money and power. His Italian suit, which had cost more than many people's annual salary, was now ruined by water sticking to his body like a second skin. I need to be alone, Marco replied without looking back, his voice almost inaudible under the drumming of the rain. Don't follow me. I'll return when I'm ready. Marco walked aimlessly through the elegant streets of the neighborhood, passing exclusive restaurants and luxury boutiques, all the places that were part of his privileged world. People ran for shelter from the storm, hardly noticing the solitary man who walked as if the rain didn't exist. Gradually, the streets became less familiar, the scenery changing to simpler areas of the city. It was as if he were crossing not just neighborhoods but invisible boundaries between different realities. 1 month, he murmured to himself, the reality of his diagnosis finally penetrating his consciousness. A whole lifetime to come to this. Absorbed in his thoughts, Marco didn't realize he had entered a completely unknown neighborhood. The lights were scarcer here, the streets narrower and less cared for. Turning a corner, he found himself in a poorly lit alley where the smell of garbage mixed with that of rain. That's when he saw them, 3 small figures huddled under a soaked piece of cardboard that barely served as shelter. In the dim light, they initially looked like a single child seen from different angles, as in a multiple exposure photograph. "It can't be," he whispered, approaching cautiously and pulling out his cell phone to use the flashlight. "Are they identical?" The phone light revealed 3 girls who seemed to have come from the same mold, same face, same frightened eyes, same soaked flowery dresses. They were the triplets, Leah, Isabel, and Iris, though Marco didn't know their names yet. Their identical faces were pale from cold and fear, but their eyes held a fierce determination that struck him even in his distracted state. "Who are you?" asked Leah, her voice trembling but firm, as she positioned herself slightly in front of her sisters, ready to protect them. "Don't come any closer." Marco stopped, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. The rain continued to pour, soaking them all, but none of them seemed to notice. He was struck by their unity, the way they instinctively formed a protective triangle, each holding the other's hand. There was something profoundly moving about their bond, something that stirred a long-buried part of him. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently, lowering the flashlight to avoid blinding them. "You're alone out here in the rain. Where are your parents?" The girls didn't answer, but their eyes said everything. They were prepared to run again at any moment, exhausted as they were. Marco observed them for a long moment, a decision forming in his mind, a decision that, given the news he had received that very day, seemed simultaneously impulsive and perfectly logical. "I won't report you," he assured them, his voice stronger now. "In fact, I have a proposal to make." Before he could continue, the door opened again, and a social worker entered. Not the same one the triplets had met at their father's hospital, but someone equally official with her clipboard and expression of impersonal efficiency. The girls instinctively moved closer to each other, preparing for another escape if necessary. "The police are looking for you 3. We all are searching. I'll need to take you to the orphanages." "You shouldn't have run away," she said, looking at the triplets with professional interest. Marco surprised everyone, including himself, with the quickness and firmness of his intervention. He straightened up in the hospital bed, ignoring the pain the movement caused him, and assumed the authoritative expression he had perfected in decades of high-level negotiations. "They saved my life," he declared, his voice leaving no room for discussion. "The least I can do is offer them a place to stay temporarily while we resolve this situation. They cannot be separated. Look at them. They're inseparable." The social worker hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance from a hospitalized patient. She began to explain standard procedures and regulations, but Marco interrupted her with an impatient gesture. With renewed vigor, he picked up the phone beside the bed and dialed a number he knew by heart. "I need you at St. Matthew's Hospital immediately," he told the person on the other end. "Yes, I'm fine, but I need urgent legal assistance. It's about 3 children. I'll explain when you get here." Marco's lawyer arrived with surprising speed, considering the late hour and the storm still falling outside. He was a middle-aged man with attentive eyes and an impeccable suit that showed no signs of rain, clearly someone accustomed to preparing for all contingencies. The triplets watched, fascinated, as he and Marco spoke in low voices before turning to the social worker. "My client is proposing a temporary guardianship arrangement," explained the lawyer with the confidence of someone who rarely loses a case. "Given the exceptional circumstances, including the vital service these children provided by saving Mr. Rodriguez's life, we request special consideration to keep the sisters together under his care until a formal hearing can be arranged." The social worker seemed uncomfortable with the pressure but also aware of who Marco Rodriguez was. His name and influence obviously weren't unknown to her. After a tense 20-minute conversation, during which the triplets remained absolutely silent, she finally yielded reluctantly. "This is completely irregular," she warned, signing a temporary authorization. "Only until the custody hearing, and there will be daily follow-up visits." A few hours later, when Marco was discharged against medical advice but with medications and strict instructions, a luxury car transported them through the city, still punished by rain. The triplets, seated together in the back seat, looked out the window with amazement at the elegant neighborhoods they passed through, a completely different world from the one they knew. When the car finally stopped before an impressive mansion protected by high walls and an ornate gate, they could hardly believe they would actually enter there. "Welcome to my home," said Marco, as the gate opened automatically. "I hope you feel comfortable here for as long as you stay." At the entrance of the mansion, however, awaited an unpleasant surprise. Cassandra Rodriguez, elegantly dressed despite the hour, stood in the foyer with an expression that mixed shock and fury. Her eyes widened upon seeing Marco enter, accompanied by 3 identical girls, all still wearing simple, wrinkled clothes that dramatically contrasted with the luxury around them. "What does this mean?" she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the spacious entrance hall. "Have you completely lost your mind? Who are these children? Why are they all dirty and ragged?" Pillsbury Donut, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. "I found out about your diagnosis. I know what happened. As if that wasn't enough, now you have these girls. Don't you care what people will think of us?" Marco, exhausted but determined, confronted his ex-wife with a calmness that surprised even himself. The triplets watched apprehensively, instinctively positioning themselves slightly behind him, as if seeking protection against the evidently hostile woman. "For the first time in years, I don't care what people will think," he responded calmly. "They saved me when nothing obligated them to do so, even while they were in trouble. That taught me something your materialism never could." The following hours were a whirlwind of new experiences for the triplets. The mansion's housekeeper, a kind and efficient lady, arranged hot baths, clean clothes, and a spacious room where the 3 could sleep together. Leah, Isabel, and Iris could barely process the radical change in their situation. From soaked streets to a mansion with marble bathtubs and soft beds in a matter of hours. "It's like one of those fairy tales that Dad used to read to us," whispered Iris while exploring the room assigned to them, her fingers timidly touching the silk sheets. "But I don't know if we should trust him yet." The mansion, which Marco would later admit he had always found cold and impersonal, gained a new life with the triplets' presence. Despite their initial caution, their childlike curiosity soon led them to carefully explore the ample spaces, marveling at details that adults barely noticed: the pattern of imported tiles, the movement of curtains under the air conditioning, the soft tinkling of the chandelier crystals when someone passed beneath. Marco, despite the physical weakness he still felt, found himself renewed observing them, as if seeing his own house for the first time through their eyes. "I never realized how immense this place is," he commented to the housekeeper, watching the girls timidly testing the living room sofas. "It seems like a waste for just one person, doesn't it?" Despite their exhaustion, none of the girls could sleep. Decades of life in luxury hadn't prepared Marco for the deep appreciation they showed for things he considered ordinary. Hot water flowing from silver faucets, refrigerators full of food, untouched toys he had bought over the years for children he never had. Their gratitude wasn't for the luxury itself but for the security they hadn't known since their father fell ill. "You must be starving," Marco suddenly realized, noting that they probably hadn't eaten properly in many hours. "Let's prepare something in the kitchen." During the improvised dinner in the mansion's immense kitchen, Marco observed with fascination the triplets' interactions, how they communicated as much with looks as with words, how they took care of each other, serving their sisters before serving themselves. There was a harmony among them that he had never witnessed between conventional siblings. When Marco left to get dessert, Cassandra, who had refused to leave despite repeated requests, observed the scene from the kitchen door, her face a mask of disapproval. "Do you think he really cares?" she suddenly said, her cutting voice interrupting the peaceful meal. "He's just using you to clear his conscience before he dies." When that happens, in a few weeks, you'll return to the street, or worse, you'll be separated anyway. The girls froze, looking at Cassandra with expressions of shock and pain. Tears began to form in Iris's eyes, while Isabel and Leah assumed protective postures. It was at that moment they noticed Marco standing at the dining room door, having just returned with desserts he wanted to show them. His face was pale, not only from illness but from the shock of hearing Cassandra so cruelly reveal his diagnosis, and from seeing the pain in the eyes of the children who, in just one day, had begun to mean so much to him. "So it's true?" asked Leah, her voice small but firm, looking directly at Marco, who was entering the kitchen at that moment. "You're dying, like our father." Marco remained motionless at the kitchen entrance, the dessert tray trembling slightly in his hands. Leah's direct question hung in the air like a sentence, demanding a truth he wasn't prepared to share. His expression, normally controlled after years of high-level negotiations, now revealed a surprising vulnerability. Cassandra remained standing, a cruel smile on her painted lips, delighting in the discomfort she had created. The triplets waited, united as always, their identical eyes fixed on Marco, not with judgment, but with a painful understanding that children their age shouldn't possess. "Yes," he finally answered, placing the tray on the table with deliberate care. "The doctors say I have advanced pancreatic cancer, but that doesn't change anything about the arrangement we made." Cassandra laughed, a cold and calculated sound that echoed across the immaculate kitchen tiles. She crossed her arms over her expensive dress, satisfaction evident in every line of her elegant body. The girls, however, didn't seem surprised or horrified by the revelation. Instead of withdrawal, their faces showed a deep understanding and compassion that Marco hadn't expected. Isabel, always observant, studied him with analytical eyes, as if assessing his actual condition beyond appearances. "How much time do you have left?" Isabel asked directly, her voice calm, pragmatic as always. "We need to know to prepare ourselves." Marco shot a withering look at Cassandra before sitting heavily in the nearest chair. The room briefly spun around him, a reminder of his fragile condition. The triplets watched him attentively, not with pity, but with practical curiosity. For the first time in his adult life, Marco decided there was no reason to hide the truth or soften it. These children had faced death up close and deserved his honesty. "1 month, according to my doctor," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "Maybe less, considering I ignored the recommendation to stay in the hospital." Iris, who until then had been silent, suddenly rose from her chair and approached Marco. Without hesitation, she placed her small hand on his, a surprisingly mature gesture of comfort. Her eyes, though identical to her sister's in shape and color, carried a unique sensitivity that touched him deeply. For a fleeting moment, Marco wondered what it would have been like to have had children, to have invested his time in people instead of bank accounts and acquisitions. "Dad was in a lot of pain, too, before he left," Iris said softly, squeezing Marco's hand. "He tried to hide it, but we always knew." Cassandra's provocative presence was becoming increasingly unbearable. With an exasperated sigh, she picked up her designer bag from the chair where she had left it and walked to the kitchen door, her high heels marking a sharp rhythm against the floor. She stopped at the door and turned, her perfect profile framed by the elegant molding. "This is pathetic, Marco," she shot, venom distilled in every syllable. "You always wanted a family, and now at the end, you improvise one with street orphans. I'll call your lawyer tomorrow about the will." After Cassandra finally left, a comfortable silence fell over the kitchen. The triplets finished their meal in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Marco watched them, admiring the resilience they demonstrated despite everything they had been through. There was dignity in how they dealt with loss, a strength that many adults he knew didn't possess. When they finally retired to sleep, Marco remained awake, rethinking the choices of his life and contemplating the little time he had left. "Strange how, in the end, it's 3 little strangers who make me question everything," he murmured to himself, observing the night through the large window. "What a waste my life has been." The days that followed created a surprisingly comfortable routine in the mansion. The triplets, although still cautious, began to adapt to the new environment. The social worker made her daily visits, always suspicious, but unable to deny that the girls were being well cared for. Marco had hired private tutors to help them recover the school time lost during their father's illness. The mansion, once a monument to elegant solitude, was gradually coming to life with children's books, colorful drawings, and the occasional sound of laughter. "I never thought I'd see this house with so many colors," commented Regularity, but unable to deny that the girls were being well cared for. Marco had hired private tutors to help them recover the school time lost during their father's illness. The mansion, once a monument to elegant solitude, was gradually coming to life with children's books, colorful drawings, and the occasional sound of laughter. "I never thought I'd see this house with so many colors," commented the housekeeper, while storing drawings the girls had made. "You seem different, too, sir. More present, despite everything." Marco, however, was getting worse with each passing day. He tried to hide the symptoms, taking pain medication when the girls weren't around, forcing himself to eat even when he had no appetite, and resting whenever he could to conserve energy for the moments he spent with them. But it was impossible to completely hide the reality of his condition. On the morning of the 5th day, during breakfast, a particularly strong wave of pain hit him while he was pouring juice for Iris. The glass escaped from his suddenly weak fingers, shattering on the floor and spreading orange juice across the immaculate tiles. "Sorry," he said, grabbing the edge of the table while closing his eyes against the searing pain. "I'm a bit clumsy today." The triplets exchanged worried glances. They knew that expression well, the sudden paleness, the cold sweat on his forehead. They had seen the same signs in their father during his final days. While the housekeeper quickly cleaned up the mess, the girls observed Marco with growing intensity. Leah noticed how his hands trembled slightly, Isabel perceived the way he had barely touched his own breakfast, and Iris saw the shadow of pain that passed across his face when he thought no one was looking. "Why don't you rest a bit after breakfast?" Leah gently suggested, using the same tone she had used with her father. "We can read by ourselves this morning." After breakfast, when Marco finally gave in to exhaustion and retired to his room, the triplets gathered in the wide hallway, conversing in urgent whispers. The fear of losing someone else so quickly was palpable between them. There was a fierce determination in their identical eyes, a refusal to passively accept another cruel blow from fate. Iris pulled her sisters closer, her normally gentle expression now intense with a sudden idea. "Remember how Dad always said he knew a doctor who treated cancer really well?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said he was the best in the world." The three walked silently down the hallway, passing expensive artwork and antiques whose value they didn't fully comprehend. The mansion, although they had been there for just a few days, was already becoming familiar in its grandeur. They found a door slightly ajar that led to Marco's private office, a sanctuary of dark wood and leather with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and an imposing computer on an antique desk. Iris pointed to the computer, her eyes shining with renewed hope. "Yes, it's true. Dad talked about a special doctor," she suddenly commented, moving toward the machine. "He said he was the best doctor in the country." Isabel, who had always been the most intellectual of the three, immediately caught the direction of her sister's thoughts. Her eyes lit up with recognition and memory. She approached the computer, fascinated by the technology she rarely had access to in her previous life. The screen was in sleep mode, subtly displaying Marco's company logo. "It's true," exclaimed Isabel, animated for the first time in days. "He always said that if we ever got really sick, we should look for Dr. Leah joined them, completing the shared memory that flowed between the three like an electric current of hope. Her eyes shone with the same recognition, the same determination. To outside observers, it was almost supernatural how they completed each other's thoughts, as if they shared not only identical appearances but also some deep mental connection. "Cruz," Leah completed, the memory sudden and clear in her mind. His name was Dr. Cruz. Dad said he saved people that no one else could save. The three looked at each other, a new mission crystallizing between them. Isabel, the most technically inclined, approached the computer with reverent caution. To her surprise and relief, the system wasn't locked. Perhaps Marco had deliberately left it that way, or perhaps he was simply unaccustomed to protecting himself inside his own home. With hesitant fingers, Isabel moved the mouse, watching the screen come fully to life. "Let's research," decided Isabel, opening the browser with the confidence of someone who had observed adults doing the same countless times. "We need to find this doctor before it's too late." The search was surprisingly easy. Just a few minutes of careful typing revealed several articles about Dr. Cruz, a renowned oncologist who had caused controversy in medical circles a few years earlier. The headlines ranged from praising to critical, but the pattern was clear: pioneering doctor defies protocols to save patients, award-winning oncologist fired for treating child without resources, Dr. Cruz continues experimental treatments at community clinic. Isabel clicked on one of the most recent articles, and the three leaned in together to read. "It says here that he was fired for using an unapproved treatment on a child who had no money," read Isabel, her finger following the lines of text, "but the child survived when everyone said it was impossible." The details of the article revealed that Dr. Cruz now worked in a modest clinic in the city suburbs, continuing his experimental treatments for terminal cancer cases that conventional hospitals had declared hopeless. The article vaguely mentioned innovative approaches and unconventional protocols without going into specific details. There was a photograph of the doctor, a middle-aged man with gentle but determined eyes, standing in front of a simple building that dramatically contrasted with the elite hospitals where he had previously worked. "It says here that he now works at a clinic in the South Zone," pointed out Iris, her finger touching the screen at the mentioned address. "It's not very far from that hospital where Dad was." The girls carefully printed the article, waiting anxiously as the state-of-the-art printer in the corner of the office produced a crisp copy. When they heard footsteps in the hallway, they quickly closed the browser and moved away from the computer, simulating innocence. Marco appeared at the door, visibly more rested after a few hours of sleep, but still with that underlying paleness that worried them so much. "What are you doing here?" he asked gently, with no accusation in his voice. "I thought you'd be in the library with the books we brought yesterday." Leah took the lead, as she always did in challenging situations. She approached Marco with the printed article in hand, her expression a mixture of pleading and determination. The other two positioned themselves behind her, forming their usual triangle of mutual support, three versions of the same face facing the man who, in such a short time, had become an important figure in their lives. "Please," begged Leah, extending the article to Marco, her intense eyes fixed on his. "Visit this doctor. Our father trusted him more than anyone." Marco took the paper, surprised by the girl's intensity. His eyes quickly scanned the article, his expression changing from curiosity to skepticism. He knew the world of elite medicine well, the rigorous protocols, the necessary approvals, the risk management policies. Doctors like this Cruz were often seen as dangerous rebels, ready to risk lives in the name of their unproven theories. At the same time, he couldn't deny the palpable hope in the triplets' eyes, a hope he didn't have the courage to destroy, even knowing it was probably unfounded. This doctor was expelled from the medical community for questionable practices, Marco explained gently, trying not to sound condescending. Experimental treatments can be dangerous and often only prolong suffering. The triplets stood firm, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that Marco found difficult to face. There was in those gazes not just childish pleading but also a wisdom born of premature suffering. Isabel stepped forward, always the most rational of the three, always ready with logical arguments that pricked the conscience. "What do you have to lose?" she asked simply, her voice calm and reasonable. "The other doctors have already said they can't do anything. Why not try?" Marco had no answer for that flawless logic. The best specialists had already sentenced his case as terminal, a month at most, predominantly of increasing pain and deterioration. What did he really have to lose? He looked again at the article, at the photo of the doctor with his tired but determined eyes. Something in that gaze vaguely reminded him of himself in his early years, before success and money had changed him. All right, he finally agreed, more to calm the girls than because he really believed in the possibility. I'll see him tomorrow, but please don't create too many expectations. The following morning brought an unexpectedly clear sky after days of rain. Marco, feeling a bit better after a surprisingly peaceful night's sleep, found the triplets already dressed and waiting in the living room when he came downstairs. They were wearing new clothes purchased by the housekeeper following Marco's instructions, simple but good quality, far from the ostentatious luxury that Cassandra would have chosen, but infinitely better than the worn-out dresses they had arrived in. "We're ready to go with you," announced Leah, her posture indicating she would not accept any argument on the matter. "We want to meet Dr. Cruz personally." Marco's private driver took the unusual entourage through the city, from the tree-lined, elegant streets of the upscale neighborhood where the mansion was located to progressively simpler and more densely populated areas. The triplets observed the transition through the window, silently noting how the city seemed divided into completely different worlds. For them, who had only known their modest neighborhood and now the luxury of the mansion, it was a revelation to see so many different layers of urban existence. "This looks more like our old neighborhood," commented Iris when they entered an area with simpler buildings and vibrant local commerce. "Look, there's even a bakery like the one near our school." Finally, after almost an hour in traffic, they arrived at a quiet street where a two-story building stood, modest but well-maintained. A small sign identified the place simply as "Community Clinic," with no specific mention of cancer treatments or oncology. Compared to the cutting-edge hospitals where Marco normally received treatment, the place seemed to belong to another era, functional, clean, but without any apparent luxury or technology. "Are you sure this is it?" Marco asked the driver, a hint of doubt in his voice. "It looks more like a regular health center." The triplets were already getting out of the car, determined in their mission. Leah firmly held the printed article as if it were a talisman that could open closed doors. Isabel observed the building with critical eyes, evaluating its structure and conditions, while Iris seemed more interested in the people coming and going, patients of all ages and appearances, many clearly of modest financial means. "It's definitely here," confirmed Leah, pointing to a small detail on the sign that Marco hadn't noticed, a discreet "Dr. Cruz, Medical Director," in smaller letters at the bottom. "Let's go in before you change your mind." The clinic's reception was simple but welcoming, with colorful plastic chairs instead of the leather sofas Marco was accustomed to finding in medical offices. A middle-aged receptionist looked up from an antiquated computer when they entered, her expression momentarily surprised to see a man in an expensive suit accompanied by three absolutely identical girls. Before Marco could speak, Leah stepped forward with surprising confidence. "We need to see Dr. Cruz urgently," she declared, her voice clear and determined despite her small stature. "Our friend is very sick with the same type of cancer they treated here before." The receptionist looked from Leah to Marco, clearly confused by the unusual dynamic but professionally discreet. She quickly consulted the computer before responding with kindness. The waiting room was already partially occupied, patients of all ages patiently awaiting their turn. Marco noticed that despite the simplicity of the place, there was an atmosphere of dignity and hope that was often lacking in the luxurious hospitals he frequented. "Dr. Cruz is with a patient now," explained the receptionist. "But I can fit you in as an emergency if the case is serious. I'll need some basic information first." While Marco filled out forms with his information, the triplets discreetly explored the small waiting room. Isabel carefully examined the diplomas and certificates framed on the walls, an impressive collection of recognitions from prestigious institutions, contrasting with the modesty of the current location. Iris observed the other patients, many visibly debilitated but with a spark of hope in their eyes that she recognized well. Leah remained close to Marco, as if fearing he might change his mind at any moment. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Marco asked her in a low voice, part of him still resisting the idea of experimental treatments. "It might not lead to anything, and I don't want you to be disappointed." Leah stared at him with a disconcerting intensity for someone so young. Her eyes, though those of a child, carried a maturity forged by early suffering. Marco felt momentarily intimidated by that direct gaze, as if she could see through the layers of skepticism he had built over the years. Better to try everything than give up without a fight, she answered simply, the words sounding as if they came from someone much older. We didn't have a chance to help our father. We don't want that to happen again. After a surprisingly short wait, they were led down a narrow hallway to an office at the back of the clinic. The space was larger than Marco expected, with medical equipment that, although not the newest, seemed well-maintained and functional. What caught his attention most, however, were the walls, covered with photographs of smiling patients, many visibly recovered from serious conditions, with handwritten thank you messages. It was a mural of hope in a place where conventional medicine had given up. Dr. Cruz will see you now, announced the nurse who had guided them there. Please wait just a moment. When the doctor finally entered, Marco was surprised by his ordinary appearance. He had expected someone eccentric, in line with his reputation as a medical rebel. But Dr. Cruz simply looked like an experienced and tired physician of medium height, with gray hair and a simple lab coat without the embroidered name of famous hospitals. He carried an old clipboard instead of the tablets that Marco's doctors typically used. His eyes, however, were extraordinarily alive and perceptive. Eyes that had seen much suffering but still believed in the possibility of healing. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Cruz, he introduced himself with a gentle smile, extending his hand first to Marco and then, with equal respect, to each of the triplets. How can I help you today? But before Marco could explain his situation, the doctor froze as he looked more carefully at the girls. An expression of sudden recognition illuminated his tired face, followed by a genuine smile that completely transformed his appearance. He crouched down to be at eye level with the triplets, studying their faces with a mixture of surprise and joy. Antonio's daughters, he exclaimed, his voice carrying genuine affection. He talked about you so much. The identical triplets who were his pride and joy. The girls looked at the doctor with astonishment and renewed hope. Iris was the first to react, approaching with unusual confidence for her. There was something in the doctor's recognition, in the way he spoke of their father, that instinctively won her trust. The three moved closer, forming their typical united semicircle. You really knew our father? Asked Iris, her voice soft but full of emotion. He said you were the best doctor in the world. Dr. Cruz smiled again, a smile that carried both joy and sadness. Antonio had been one of his most dedicated nurses before transferring to another hospital to be closer to home after the triplets' birth. They had kept in touch over the years, sharing interesting cases and discussing innovative treatments. Your father was one of the best nurses I've ever worked with, the doctor replied, the sincerity evident in his voice. I heard of his recent death, and I deeply regret it. He helped save many lives. Marco observed the interaction with growing interest. It was evident that there was a genuine connection between the doctor and the girls, something he hadn't anticipated. The coincidence seemed almost arranged by fate, the daughters of his former colleague appearing in his clinic with an ailing millionaire. Dr. Cruz finally straightened up, turning his professional attention to Marco. And you must be the patient, he concluded, gesturing for Marco to sit in the examination chair. From what I understand, you have a diagnosis of advanced pancreatic cancer. As Marco explained his situation and handed over the envelope with his tests and medical reports, Dr. Cruz listened attentively, making occasional notes on his clipboard. There wasn't the usual averted gaze or expressions of regret that Marco had received from his previous doctors, just focused attention and professional analysis. The triplets watched the process with intense interest, especially Isabel, whose analytical eyes missed no detail of the interaction. I was director of the oncology department at Central Hospital for 15 years, explained Dr. Cruz as he examined the X-rays against the light, until I decided to treat a child with an experimental protocol that saved her life but violated hospital policies. The story that followed was both inspiring and disturbing, an award-winning and respected doctor who had sacrificed his prestigious and financially comfortable position for principles. Dr. Cruz explained how he had been forced to choose between following established protocols that condemned certain patients to death or risking his career by seeking unapproved alternatives that offered a chance, however small. "Some think medicine is a business," he said, a hint of bitterness momentarily coloring his normally calm voice. "I always thought it was a mission." After carefully examining all tests and reports, Dr. Cruz remained silent for a few minutes, clearly absorbed in deep reflection. Marco, accustomed to quick and decisive responses from expensive specialists, felt strangely comforted by this more deliberate process. Finally, the doctor put the X-rays aside and looked directly at Marco, without beating around the bush or offering false hopes. "There is an experimental treatment," he finally said, his voice cautious but not without hope. "Something I was testing, researching, but that's still in the trial phase. But it has already saved people in situations like yours." Marco felt divided between the ingrained skepticism from years of dealing with empty promises in the business world and the sincere hope he saw in the triplets' eyes. Part of him wanted to believe, even if only to not disappoint the girls who had worked so hard to bring him here. Another part remained defensively skeptical, protective against the pain of false hope. "What are the chances of it working?" he asked directly, his business tone briefly returning. "I need real numbers, not false hopes." Dr. Cruz appreciated the frankness of the question. His expression showed respect for Marco's desire for clarity, even in such a desperate situation. There was no condescension in his response, only professional honesty tempered by years of experience dealing with the thin line between hope and illusion. "Honestly, 10%, he replied without hesitation. "But it's better than zero, which is what other hospitals are offering." A profound silence fell over the room. 10%, one chance in 10, numbers that any rational investor would consider unacceptable. Marco looked at the triplets, expecting to see disappointment on their faces. Instead, he saw something surprising, genuine hope, as if 10% was a wonderful promise. He then realized how perspective changes when zero is the only other option available. "When do we start?" he asked the doctor, a new resolution shining in his eyes. The scene quickly changed to a treatment room at the back of the clinic. Unlike the office, this space surprised Marco.